Hello again, and welcome back to Year 5 of the Religious Education Initiative. This is Week 3 and Day 1. So we're continuing through the book of Genesis. Last time we saw the sons of Jacob take center stage, with Joseph, the older son of Rachel and the favorite of his father, having and sharing dreams about how he was going to be the ruler of all the family. His father, who favored him, gave him a multicolored and rich robe, a sign of his favor, and his brothers were jealous of that favor and hated Joseph. When they had an opportunity, they planned to kill him, but Reuben, the oldest, was opposed to that plan and convinced them to just put him in a pit, planning to come himself and rescue him later. But while Reuben was away, the other brothers decided to sell Joseph into slavery, at least not to kill him, and Joseph was then taken into Egypt as a slave. So this time we will see what happens next. So this is verse 29 of chapter 37, and then we'll continue on. Skipping chapter 38, we'll explain why. So when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he rent his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The lad is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and killed a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the long robe with sleeves and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." And he recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob rent his garments, and put sackcloth upon his loins, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. That's the end of chapter 37. We're going to skip chapter 38, as it is a sordid story, not really appropriate for younger families. Older families could read it if they wanted to. Parents should read it first and see if they want to tackle these issues. In the chapter, we see Jacob's fourth son, Judah, take a wife from among the Canaanites and father 3 sons. In the course of the story, his wife dies, and 2 of his sons die because they are wicked, but Judah has 2 more sons with the widow of his oldest son. It's an ugly story, which shows how far Judah has fallen from the high call of the God of his fathers, but we do at least see a hint of repentance in Judah by the end of the story. So, moving on to, returning to Joseph's story in chapter 39, and continuing. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and having him, he had no concern for anything but the food which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome and good-looking, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and said to his master's wife, "Lo, having me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me, except yourself, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie with her, or to be with her. But one day when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand, and fled, and got out of the house. And when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand, and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household, and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment with me, and fled, and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment with me, and fled out of the house. When his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, This is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. Okay. So there's a lot that happens here, and we could deal with a lot of things. We can talk about how Reuben is not like his other brothers. He's not trying to have Joseph killed. He wants to rescue him and bring him back to his father. Maybe Reuben's trying to curry favor. Maybe he's just a little bit older and sees how badly this is going to go. Maybe he's already in a process of repentance for his sin with his father's concubine. We don't see, but we understand, and we passed over Judah's whole ugly story. This is apparently happening simultaneously to the story of Joseph. And then we see Joseph, and we didn't really know a lot about Joseph's character, but now that we see him in Egypt, we see that he is faithful to God. We see that God is honoring him, which is a sign that Joseph is faithful to God. And we see that Joseph, being favored by God, nonetheless is an object of jealousy and of attack from those around him. And ultimately his master's wife is trying to seduce him, to tempt him to to this great sin, a sin against his master and a sin against God, because Joseph has been entrusted by both his master and by God with, in the case of his master, with all of his master's possessions, and he's been entrusted by God with grace and success and glory and favor, which, if he then abuses that to pursue his own pleasure, his own desires, his own satisfaction, this is a still greater betrayal of the gift of God. And not just I, but many of the fathers will reflect on this, will reflect on Joseph and his resisting of temptation, and the reasons that he resists temptation as an example to all of us, because we all have received a grace and a gift from God, his favor, simply in the life that we live, in the food that we eat, the clothes that we wear, the homes in which we live, the peace and security which we enjoy. We are richly blessed by God, and when we then seize these things and use these things, abuse these good things to turn against God, to replace God, then these are great sins against God, even if we can manage to avoid falling into the great sins of adultery that Joseph is being tempted to. But one sin leads to another. So Joseph resists this sin because he has habituated himself. He has made a habit of faithfulness, of piety, of obedience, of right relationship with God. But all of Joseph's righteousness doesn't protect him from this slander, and he's unjustly sent to prison. God hasn't abandoned him, but Joseph is not having a very good time right now. And this, too, is a good thing for us to remember, that God does not prevent us from being tested. God is faithful, but that doesn't mean we won't suffer. That doesn't mean we won't have trials and tribulations. The Lord promises us this self-same thing. When he says, in this world you will have many trials, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. So, anyway, these are the things that we should have in mind as we see Joseph. Joseph is very much like all of us, or we should aspire to be like Joseph. Anyway, God bless you all. We'll see you shortly for the day 2 readings. So God bless you.